Hey, what's up guys, Ruff here. So over the past week or so, there's been a lot of comparisons made by games journalists and social media users between the games Marathon and Crimson Desert, despite the fact that they really have nothing to do with each other in terms of their genres. However, they were released in the same month, and a lot of people are pointing out the dichotomy between these games, mainly how Marathon was showered with praise from games journalists and activists on social media who are very, very fervent in their defense of this game's supposed financial success. And on the other hand, you have Crimson Desert that has been chastised by games journalists and has been turning things around and proving a lot of these journalists wrong. Now, beginning with Marathon, a lot of people are looking at the Steam chart numbers and saying, wow, things do not look very good for this game given its budget that is expected to be in the hundreds of millions. As it turns out, according to Forbes, Steam is 70% of Marathon's population, and looking at the numbers on Steam charts, it is not looking good at all. And no matter how much games journalists want to pump life into this game, Marathon is not achieving the level of success it needs to actually make some sort of revenue for Bungie. Compare that to Crimson Desert that just announced only days after release, it has surpassed 3 million copies sold, and that is despite a very active crusade by games journalists to convince you this game is dead on arrival and not worth your time. Now let's go back to Marathon, and this is where we're going to start. This is the extraction shooter that many people claim is the latest and greatest of its genre, and it's built a very defensive fan base who believes this game is not just enjoyable, but financially successful. Again, the budget for this is expected somewhere in the hundreds of millions, so the number of copies they need to sell is very, very high for this to break even. Now, this got the red carpet treatment from games journalists. There was countless articles promoting this to this day. In fact, it got the classic meme where PC Gamer made their article saying, "The Marathon server slam consumed my weekend. 21 hours later, I've gone from meh to believer." And this follows a series of very disastrous headlines from PC Gamer where they had the same sort of attitude towards games like High Guard, Suicide Squad Killed the Justice League, Concord, Assassin's Creed Shadows, and of course, Star Wars Outlaws that were all massive flops. And looking at the numbers for Marathon, we're about a month after its initial release, and it's sitting at 26,000 in-game players, and it's dropped off pretty steadily over the course of time. Now, of course, people will say, well, 26,000, that's a lot of people. Yes, it is, but not the number of people they were expecting for a game like this, that again has a very high budget. They probably were expecting a lot more, especially only a few weeks since its release. Now, people have been very defensive about the Steam charts or Steam DB numbers involving Marathon. Literally on day one, people were already scolding people for pointing out the lackluster numbers for Marathon, basically saying Steam reviews are positive, so the actual numbers really don't matter. And also they were proudly claiming that Marathon had a little fire emoji next to it, which literally means nothing because that was the first day of its release, and all that emoji means is that it's reached its peak concurrent player count in the last 24 hours. Well, guess what? It only released within the last 24 hours, so that is an automatic symbol when it releases. But anyways, we also saw former Kotaku journalists like Alyssa Mercante not only say you are stupid for paying attention to Steam charts, you're possibly a predator in real life as well for using them. Absolutely insane copium. But yeah, it turns out the people who were paying attention to Steam charts were right once again. This keeps happening over and over again, and Marathon is another example of that. Forbes has come out and confirmed that Steam represents 70% of Marathon's population, with PS5 and Xbox making up the remaining 30%. And this is based on some findings by Reese Elliott, who shared this, stating, "Marathon has sold 1.2 million copies across Steam, PS5, and Xbox." And that is a very brutal number, especially given the fact that there's an estimated generated gross revenue of $55 million. Keep in mind, again, the budget is expected to be somewhere in the hundreds of millions. And Reese goes further, saying, looking at the split, we have the 70% here, about 800,000 copies sold through Steam, and the remaining roughly 350,000 is split between PS5 and Xbox. And this is a set of numbers that has been basically confirmed by Forbes journalist Paul Tassi, who came out and said, yeah, the player count reports that we just saw are close to the reality. This is someone with insiders at Bungie, and he is saying that number we just looked at is in fact close to the actual numbers at Bungie. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an absolute disaster. Okay, you can say Marathon is fun, you can say you're enjoying it, fine, that's your prerogative, and a lot of people are enjoying it. But financially speaking, this game looks like an absolute failure. And I think it's pretty much confirmed at this point. When you're talking about a game with a massive budget like this, 1.2 million copies sold is not going to cut it, especially when there's estimates that they need to sell somewhere around 6 to 7 million to break even. That is alarming. I mean, we're closing in on the first month of this game's release. Things are not going to speed up anytime soon. Even if we round up to 1.5 million, let's say it's off by that much, that's still a really bad number. And once again, the Steam charts were proven reliable. This keeps happening over and over again. Some game like Marathon comes out, the numbers look underwhelming on Steam. People say, hey, that's not looking good for that game. And those people are told that they're crazy, that they're relying on inaccurate information, and that Steam is unreliable, or Steam charts. And, well, once again, the people who are looking at those numbers and saying this is alarming were correct. Once again, this is really bad for Marathon, ladies and gentlemen. It's so bad, even IGN is reporting that this hasn't exactly made a splash that Sony and Bungie wanted. Reminder, this is the same IGN that only days ago was lambasting Crimson Desert for its use of AI-generated art assets, while ironically themselves using an AI journalism tool called Sprout Social in order to call them out for using AI-generated art assets. The jokes write themselves, ladies and gentlemen, but looking at Crimson Desert, despite a barrage of negative articles, this really was the focus of so much negative press coverage. Despite all of that, it's sitting at nearly 200,000 in-game players right now, just a few days after release. It has rebounded from a flurry of negativity that had a real impact. IGN came out with a 6. They gave this a 6 out of 10. Now, of course, keep in mind, as pointed out by Smash JT, IGN also gave Dustborn and Concord a 7 and Dragon Age the Veilguard a 9. So what does IGN really know? Not much, but people apparently relied on these sorts of ratings, and I'll explain why in just a second. But here's another example of how petty and ridiculous these reviews were from the supposed professional critics like those at Kotaku, saying after playing 12 hours of Crimson Desert, the only takeaway was pretty rocks. That's it. That's what they got out of 12 hours of playing this game. Rocks. And of course, Kotaku was one of the many journalists who happily, almost gleefully, share that after the very negative instant reviews after this release, the stock of Pearl Abyss, the developers of Crimson Desert, the stock plummeted by 30%. This was in the first day or so after its release, largely due to a lot of negative reviews, both by critics and by people who were very, well, let's just say quick to dismiss this game. And of course, you have people like this, day one on release, tagging content creators and trying to shame them, making the comparison between Marathon and Crimson Desert, basically saying, you guys had concerns about the number of copies sold for Crimson or for Marathon. How do you explain what's going on with Crimson Desert? Well, these sorts of posts would age like milk, because now Crimson Desert, not even a week after its initial launch, has broken 3 million copies sold. And no, this is not a Ubisoft situation. We're not talking about player numbers. We're We're talking about copies sold. This is a great start for this game. Like I said, we're not even a week past its launch, so this is really good. Things are turning around beautifully for this team, right? Like, things were looking really grim. Despite some pretty solid numbers on Steam charts, the reviews were really hurting this game, but things have turned around once people moved past these games journalists and said, wait a minute, I'm going to try this out for myself and not accept their narrative. And just look at the reviews, for example, on Metacritic. The user score has now surpassed the Metascore, the critic score, and that was something that rose by nearly 1.5 points over the past couple of days because people have had a lot more of an openness to try this game and to put a large number of hours into it to fully grasp how much they like this game or not, and it turns out a lot of people really do. In fact, that sort of 50-50 split on the Steam ratings has completely flipped to nearly 80%. It is now at an 80% critical reception, and Pearl Abyss, the developer's stock, has shot up by 23%. It's basically stabilized after the first couple of days since the launch, right? It dropped by 30, it's back up 23% because people listened to the reviewers. If this is not proof that the people who are investing in this stuff are idiots, I don't know what else to tell you, because these investors jumped ship in the day or two after this release when they saw the negative reviews from games journalists. And now they're crawling back once the actual players went out there, ignored the games journalists, and experienced for themselves and enjoyed it. And now this game is a flying success. And again, think about the 3 million copies sold. Isn't that a very interesting number? So that's in less than a week. Compare that to Marathon. Because all these screechers on social media, they're the ones who made the comparison between Marathon and Crimson Desert, despite the fact they have nothing to do with each other in terms of their genres. They just got released within a small window of each other. But they said that Marathon was a big success and Crimson Desert was something to be ashamed of if you supported it or thought it was going to succeed. Well, they have over 3 million copies sold, and it looks like Marathon has about 1.2 million, and that's a full month out of its release. Yeah, that's nearly triple what Marathon is doing. In fact, even if we round up to 1.5 million copies, let's say the estimate is a little bit off, a little bit short, that's still double. Crimson Desert has double. That is a pretty big deal, ladies and gentlemen. And yeah, all the people who are spiking the football, they're taking a victory lap here with Marathon, and they're trying to dunk on Crimson Desert. Well, they're definitely eating their words right now. And it's raised up some pretty interesting conversations about what games are working and what ones are not. And if you look at the games that are big successes, a lot of them were doubted by games journalists and activists on social media. And over here is an example of a bunch of games that were hyped up by those same people, and they have failed mightily. There is definitely a lot to take away from this situation, but I really wanted to compare Marathon and Crimson Desert because that's what people are doing, and it's not the victory they thought. And good on Crimson Desert and good on Pearl Abyss for turning these things around, because it was looking pretty grim. They were getting actually affected by these negative reviews. It was making people apprehensive, whether it's investing into their team or trying the game out in the first place. But eventually, the truth prevailed. People enjoyed the product, and that narrative has been overwhelmingly spread, and it's overtaken what the games journalists were trying to do. And unfortunately for Marathon, those games journalists were not able to pump any life into this game, or at least enough to make it a financial success. But that's going to do it for today's video. As always, feel free to share your thoughts about today's topics in the comment section down below. Hope you guys enjoy the video, and I'll see you next time.